FPS Boost, a pretty fantastic initiative from Microsoft actually, using DirectX API tweaks on the Xbox Series consoles to double or even quadruple the frame rate of Xbox One and Xbox 360 games. PlayStation 5, well, we got a range of 60 FPS update patches on select titles, including some genuine classics, while out-of-the-box back-compat improved dynamic resolution scaling pixel counts and delivered performance boosts on titles with unlocked frame rates. However, many PlayStation 4 games, too many PlayStation 4 games I'd venture to suggest, remain locked at 30 FPS running under back-compat when they could be offering so much more. And only now, with frame rate unlock mods on exploited PlayStation 5 consoles, none of this will work on retail consoles, yeah, only with those mods are we beginning to see the rich potential on offer there. So in this video, put together with Illusion, the modder who delivered many of these unlocks, well, we'll be revisiting a massive range of games from the PS4 era, looking to run them at 60 frames per second on PlayStation 5. And yeah, perhaps spoiling the fun here, but short of developer intervention or an FPS Boost style initiative from Sony itself, all of the games you'll see here today will remain locked at 30 FPS on PlayStation 5. At least to the best of our knowledge, think of this as a fascinating what if, featuring a raft of some of the finest games to hit the Generation 8 PlayStation, and a couple of outlier titles that I asked Illusion to unlock just to see what would happen. But our first focus is going to be DriveClub. It had to be, the brilliant racer from Evolution Studios. A contentious game at launch, but these days it's rightly revered as a genuine classic racer that Sony just left behind. And what you're looking at here is the game running at a glorious 60 frames per second on a modded PlayStation 5. 30 FPS frame rate cap is removed. And actually this is an interesting starting point for our look at scalability across 3 different Sony consoles. On PS4 and PS4 Pro, the mod is actually disabling VSync. It's running unlocked, and as we're nowhere near the 60 FPS limit, you can kind of look at it as a benchmark of sorts. DriveClub never received a PS4 Pro patch, so the footage here is the PS4 code running under boost mode. I'm not sure Sony ever released an explanation of what boost mode actually does, but I'm inclined to think you get the extra CPU performance and the extra GPU clocks, but no access to the extra 18 compute units that the PlayStation 4 Pro delivered. Even so, the benchmarks are interesting as we shift to a 3-way view. The benchmarking angle kind of falls flat on PlayStation 5 as it hits and sustains 60 FPS. We just don't know the full performance level with VSync active. But before we move on though, I'm going to remove the tear indicators from the grid just to make things a little bit more legible. In the first clip here, the Pro runs 13% faster than the base PS4, broadly in line with the increase of GPU clock speed delivered by the Pro. We're looking at 35.5 FPS on PS4, 40.1 on the Pro. This is as good a demonstration as any of why it made sense to lock to 30 FPS on last-gen hardware. It gets nowhere near to 60. Even so, in benchmarking terms, PS5, 69% faster than PS4 and 50% faster than Pro. But with VSync active and a 60 FPS limit reached, I suspect the PS5's barely breaking a sweat here. This second clip also sees similar performance differentials between PS4 and Pro, though base frame rate rises to circa 39 FPS on base hardware, moving up to 44 FPS on Pro. And the same sort of thing is happening here in the third clip, but this time base frame rates are lower, so PS5 73% faster than PS4. But there's something odd about this last clip here, where boost mode on the Pro is delivering a 23% performance uplift over the base PS4, faster than the 13 to 14% we'd expect from boost mode's extra GPU clocks. So I'm wondering if the CPU boost on the Pro side is having an impact here. Certainly the most plausible explanation. Still, it's all about the 60 FPS experience on PlayStation 5, right? Which really does look great. You can't help but wish that some kind of native frame rate unlock was made available back in the day to facilitate like extra performance in forward compatibility, if you like. Wouldn't have helped the PlayStation 4, but would have transformed the game once PS5 arrived. I also wondered why DriveClub got a PSVR upgrade but no Pro support, bearing in mind that both Pro and VR arrived virtually at the same time. So it turns out that the VR version of DriveClub was developed by Evolution itself after a painful layoff period for the developer, but before it was shut down for good. Looking back, I can't help but feel that pro support would have been a higher priority, but hey, that's just me. Next up, let's remain in the domain of PlayStation 4 titles that never received a pro patch, so remain locked at 1080p Full HD resolution. And yes, suffice it to say that Batman Arkham Knight is a game transformed at 60 frames per second. Very much a game of its era though, so for all the beautiful imagery we got, there's still some very basic anti-aliasing here. Still, I'd say it looks fantastic at 60. Looking at base PS4 performance unlocked, remember the original ran with a 30 FPS cap, well, it's kind of intriguing as rendering through the city streets shows why the 30 FPS cap is warranted. There's not much horsepower left in the PS4 to do much more until you move skywards where there's less being rendered. So yeah, less to render, higher frame rates. Combat in the city streets sits within a 30 to 40 FPS no man's land, so again confirming a game designed for 30 FPS with overhead to spare to ensure consistency. The Batmobile sections prove to be a tough workout for both CPU and GPU though, and it is possible to dip beneath 30 on base hardware, but generally we're just north of the frame rate cap. Knife edge stuff really. Looking to PlayStation 5 running the same code, under backwards compatibility and with Illusion's frame rate unlock in place, there's some interesting results on this one because this actually required a brace of frame rate unlocks, not just one. According to Illusion, most of the unlocks he delivers for PS4 era titles remove calls to Sony's API for half-rate VSync. But doing so here in Arkham Knight takes us to 59 frames per second, meaning we're getting some slight judder, and frame rate can actually dip beneath 59 FPS, which is nonsensical when you think about the sheer performance level PlayStation 5 has at its disposal. This actually necessitated Illusion to go back and remove a second frame rate limiter that was in place on Arkham Knight, a defective cap seemingly put in place by Unreal Engine itself, and never used in the original game, of course. Even so, there are some minor dropped frames on the Batmobile section, which makes me wonder whether some kind of system-level limitation is in place for compatibility purposes. Something that we'll go into in a little more depth later on when we take a look at a more noticeably impacted game. I'm going to stick with titles limited to the base PS4 because, man, for years now I've really wanted to see how Just Cause 3 looks on PlayStation 5 running unlocked, and you must remember this one from back in the day. Just Cause's physics were just too much for the PS4 and Xbox One Jaguar CPU cores, and so here we are with some frankly hilarious drops to performance when the fireworks really kick off. And yeah, of course, we have the frame rate unlocks in place here, but it makes little odds really, as we're so CPU limited, we're into the 20s. And of course, fans of the game, and indeed fans of Digital Foundry who've seen our coverage in the past, will know it can go even lower. Rerunning those same areas on PlayStation 5, we have a game transformed, locked 60 frames per second, no problems at all. This probably wouldn't be too much of a challenge for the PlayStation 5 hardware, bearing in mind that PC processors of its era could handle this title at 60 FPS, which leads us on to why Just Cause 3 had such profound issues to begin with. When I met with Square Enix to talk over Just Cause 4, I was told that the physics were only using 2 of the available cores in the PS4, meaning that single-thread performance was key to a good experience. Not a good fit for Jaguar, right? But no problem for PC. As it stands, PS5's Zen 2 cores have more than enough performance not only to hit a consistent 30 FPS out of the box, but also to hit 60 once Illusion's frame rate cap unlocker is put into play. Just in these clips, we can see anything up to a 3 times performance multiplier thanks to that extra CPU horsepower, and to put it frankly, well, it's a completely different game. It's brilliant, it's so much better. So I was looking to repeat the trick on Just Cause 4, a game that didn't rate particularly highly when it launched, but one that I rather like. This one was capped at 30 FPS, just like its predecessor, but developer Avalanche completely revamped the CPU threading model with a jobs-based alternative, effectively distributing physics across all available cores where processing time is available. This was then combined with a dynamic resolution scaling solution which helped to keep performance much closer to its target 30 FPS across the board. The game would scale up to 1440p on PS4 Pro, but we're not quite seeing the performance multiplier we'd like to see here on the PlayStation 5, and 60 frames per second is elusive. Large explosions and, in particular, screen-filling smoke effects cause performance to plummet on the PS5, and you might be wondering why. Perhaps the reason why is that not all games running under backwards compatibility on PS5 are able to tap into the full power of the system. As I understand it, in order for some games to run as they should, Sony can assign different performance profiles to them. One profile offers up base PS4 performance with a CPU boost, as I understand it. A second profile is essentially a PS4 Pro setup with extra CPU and GPU clocks, while the third, a kind of last resort option, essentially configures the PS5 as a PS4 with limited CPU clocks. We've seen some evidence of arbitrary limits in place when we first took a look at PS5 backcompat. The disc version of Assassin's Creed Unity runs with an unlocked frame rate, but PS5 is unable to sustain 60 FPS, something that Xbox Series consoles do without issue. Indeed, Microsoft even added AC Unity to its FPS Boost collection, so even the patch code, which does lock to 30 FPS, usually hits 60 instead on the Xbox machines. So perhaps that explains the disappointment here with Just Cause 4. Interestingly, Illusion discovered something else. Within the Just Cause 4 codebase for PS4 Pro, Avalanche actually has support for checkerboard 4K rendering as well as a 1440p DRS solution. Let's take a look at the checkerboard solution first, running on both PS4 Pro and PS5 with 30 FPS caps removed, of course. Interesting stuff here as the Pro is routinely sitting into the mid-20s here, way off its intended performance target. Just Cause 4 is a dynamic game, so it's hard to completely match the footage left and right, but I've tried to synchronize big explosions on the same parts of the scenery so we get some idea of the divide. So the PS4 Pro results across all of my clips here sit in the mid-20s, only averaging at around 40 FPS on PS5, a circa 50% improvement to performance. So again, I suspect that what compatibility profile PS5 is using here isn't delivering full power in a world where on the GPU side we should expect to see at least twice the performance level, which we do see in a big bunch of the games running under backcompat. We can repeat these comparisons with the 1440p DRS mode, where opening up the resolution window on PS4 Pro and removing checkerboard processing sees average frame rates rise from the mid-20s of checkerboard 4K up to the early 30s. And now the PS5 is faring much better with average performance sitting in the high 50s. But this is a great example of how frame rate averages flatter to deceive, as large explosions, smoke and particle effects still have a gigantic hit on PS5 performance. And in one example here, it's right down into the low 30s. So again, possibly some further evidence of some kind of compatibility profile in play, holding back performance that the user will never see with the standard 30 FPS cap, but something that is clearly evident when the frame rate limit is removed. Let's move on to some less complicated fare now as we tackle the Crash Bandicoot N.Sane Trilogy remake and Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. These titles ran at 1440p on PS4 Pro, doggedly locked to 30 FPS. And at the same time, you couldn't help but wonder why 60 frames per second was off the table, especially when the far less capable base Xbox One was also delivering full 1080p on both games. There was always the sense that there was more GPU horsepower available on PS4 Pro that was never fully tapped into. So you're probably quite surprised at the turnout as you're seeing it here. On the Pro, here in Crash Bandicoot N.Sane Trilogy, there are some occasional spurts above 30 FPS, but for the most part, still running at the same frame rate despite the cap being removed. Meanwhile, PS5 is doing the business as we'd expect, locking the game to 60 frames per second. So I think what's happening here is a classic double buffer VSync situation. If a frame renders at 16.7 milliseconds or under, it'll display, but if it takes longer, it will wait another 16.7 milliseconds until it finally reaches the screen. In effect, the GPU is stalling. Triple buffer keeps another frame in reserve and can help boost frame rate significantly, but that's clearly not what's happening here, right? As for the PlayStation 5, there's so much GPU horsepower available that each and every frame completes ahead of the 16.7 millisecond cutoff point. So a new frame is displayed with every single screen refresh. End result, we get the FPS boost effects we want on this excellent title, a totally locked 60 frames per second. Though here there's not much we can really do about the 1440p resolution. I mean, it's a limitation of the PS4 Pro version. Similar setup for Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. Curiously, despite being developed by Beenox as opposed to Vicarious Visions, who handled the N.Sane Trilogy. Yeah, the resolutions are the same. Again, the same kind of pseudo-lock to 30 FPS on the Pro, even though we know the hardware is capable of more. And even though the frame rate cap has been removed, double buffer VSync is limiting us to 30 FPS, with some frames occasionally breaking through. As you would expect, once again the PS5 has more than enough GPU horsepower on tap to ensure that every frame arrives before that 16.7 millisecond cutoff, meaning that this particular karting game runs at 60 FPS locked, which, and let's be honest here, is highly desirable for a karting game. One thing that is curious though is that the rendering load of different circuits can vary quite significantly. So there are areas in some tracks where the Pro can consistently render under that 16.7 millisecond limit. So the frame rate cap unlock there does work, albeit with some jarring drops to performance. There are hints of 60 FPS in other words. Next up, let's move on to something a lot simpler. Bluepoint's excellent remake of Shadow of the Colossus shipped with 1440p quality mode and 1080p performance modes on PS4 Pro. And after some low resolution texture problems in back compat, Sony actually went back and fixed that via a firmware update. But on PS5, ideally we'd want the best of both worlds, right? For quality mode to run at 60 frames per second. And there is precedent for that, bearing in mind what Sony Santa Monica did with God of War 2018. And yeah, mods on PlayStation 5 can remove that 30 FPS cap. So looking at PS4 Pro, once the encumbrance of the 30 FPS limit is removed, effects-heavy battles with the Colossi push the game to its limits, and you can see there's not much juice left beyond 30 FPS. The lowest frame rate recorded here is just 32 frames per second. Beyond that, we move on to a maximum in the mid-40s. This is fertile ground for PlayStation 5 of course, when the same frame rate unlock is unleashed under backwards compatibility. It's a flawless 60 frames per second experience. Since we're talking about titles from Sony's rich history of excellent Japanese development, let's move on to another PS4 era game that thrives when unlocked on PlayStation 5. And as you've no doubt guessed, this is Gravity Rush 2, another title locked to 30 FPS in its stock retail form. And here we're looking at the PS4 Pro version of the game, kicking off with its native 1080p mode. This is almost certainly CPU limited on the Pro, but even so, performance not too bad actually. Just prone to the kinds of inconsistency that impacted the games we did see on the Pro that did unlock the frame rate. We're essentially in a kind of 40 to 60 FPS window here, which isn't ideal. We want some sort of consistency really. Gravity Rush 2's 4K output mode, again 30 FPS stock. Now this mode is rather interesting, as while pixel counting suggests it's running at native 2160p, the reality is quite different. Geometry processing is carried out at full resolution, but textures and shading are all calculated at 1080p and upscaled. Another game, Bound, also used this method. It's computationally a lot more expensive than native 1080p though. As you can see, we're basically in a kind of 30 to 45 FPS window here. But again, that's almost perfect for the PlayStation 5 once the unlocked version of the game is run on an exploited console. And while this is a compromised 4K in effect, it works, mostly owing to the style of the artwork, where much of the detail resides in the geometry, in this kind of cel-shaded aesthetic. And it should go without saying that performance is essentially perfect at 60 frames per second, no matter what we throw at the game and no matter how dense things get. The style of the game benefits so much from the improved frame rate that you can't help but wonder whether maybe, just maybe, Sony could go back and revisit this one, taking it from what is now a mod to an official upgrade. Bearing in mind that Sony seemed to be showing clips from a Gravity Rush movie at CES 2024, making this game everything it could be on PlayStation 5 just kind of seems like a no-brainer to me. Initially, there are a few surprises when we look at The Last Guardian, a game that really stands to benefit immensely from proper PS5 support. You can play an earlier version of the game with an unlocked frame rate via the disc release, but it has game-breaking bugs, no HDR support and other problems requiring a patch, which added a 30 FPS limit. But what you're seeing here is the patched version with the frame rate cap removed. Out of the box, the game runs at 1890p resolution, but in checkerboard format, though there is a 1080p mode if you set your console to output a full HD signal. Still, based on this footage, The Last Guardian is a really taxing game for the PS4 Pro, routinely dipping into the 20s, and it's even possible to go lower into the teens. Just removing that frame rate cap again lets the PS5 do its thing. We're back to a nigh-on-locked 60 frames per second. Yeah, there are some dips here and there in the ultra-heavy scenes, but mostly we're locked to 60. But it's actually more to The Last Guardian than meets the eye, as the developers coded up support for fully native 4K rendering, something we never saw in the actual shipping game, but it is in there, in the code. Now this is pretty disastrous when we run it on the PS4 Pro, which was already struggling in parts at 1890p checkerboard. And it's so demanding that not even the PS5 can run it locked to 60 FPS. Still, it does sit within the VRR frame rate window in most of the clips we have. And this three-way clip is intriguing, showing how Pro at 1890p checkerboard running unlocked stacks up against PS5 running with the same setup, and then PS5 again running at native 4K. Obviously, native 4K is a lot more work than 1890p checkerboard, right? Even so, it's quite impressive to see the PS5 still delivers very high frame rates here. Are we looking at the limits of the console? I'd say no. Back compat taps into extra clocks and extra bandwidth. It gives you all the power of the Zen 2 CPU cluster, but the GPU itself is operating in backwards compatibility mode. It isn't taking advantage of everything that the RDNA 2 architecture has to offer, as you might expect from games developed before the architecture was even devised. Even so, a fascinating what if right here. The problem is that the game still hangs up even with Illusion's unlocks, and will require further developer assistance to get this one running fully unlocked at 60 with no issues. Finally, and for many the game they've been waiting to see in this video, a chance to see whether modding can deliver a 60 FPS rendition of Red Dead Redemption 2. So some ground rules: if your console is set to 1080p output on the front end, you'll get a native 1080p output, while a pretty basic and blurry checkerboard 2160p mode is also available, but only if you set the console output to 4K. This applies whether you're gaming on PS4 Pro or PS5, but in this three-way you can see both modes running on Pro stacked up against the checkerboard 4K mode operating on PlayStation 5. Now, you may recall some of the content of these clips as originating as test areas in our original Red Dead Redemption 2 coverage, and here they are revisited in a whole new way, frame rate limits removed, PS5 added to the mix. Kicking off with the barroom fight, you can see how the Pro at 4K can slightly dip beneath the 30 FPS threshold, while the 1080p mode struggles to do much beyond 30 to 40 FPS, 40 being a common limit. We're likely looking at a CPU limitation at that point. PS5 though, it's got all the horsepower it needs. It powers through at 60 frames per second locked. Basic traversal in the open world, well, here it seems that the CPU is somewhat less occupied as the 1080p performance level on the Pro is improved into the mid-40s now, but you can see how close to the knife edge PS4 Pro is in its 4K checkerboard mode. Meanwhile, PlayStation 5 takes that same mode, doubling the performance, or better. Again, a locked 60 frames per second in this test clip. Very similar situation kicks off here in this mission with lots of gunplay and AI agents in place. Clear water between Pro operating in checkerboard 4K mode where we're GPU limited, and at 1080p where we're almost certainly hitting the limits of the Pro's Jaguar CPU cluster. PS5, no problems whatsoever, and it's another 60 FPS lock. Finally, a look at Saint-Denis, which is a pretty big town slash city, and where PS4 Pro is taxed to its limits on both 4K and 1080p modes. This is the first time where we see the unlocked performance of both operating around the 30 FPS cap. In short, one of the most demanding areas of the game for all parts of the Pro's architecture. And yeah, unlock the frame rate and PlayStation 5 runs the game at 60 frames per second. 60 FPS, locked, almost. As we continue through our circuit of the town, there are some dropped frames here, which I consider quite interesting as, in theory, the PlayStation 5 should be wiping the floor with a checkerboard 2160p, just as it did in Horizon Zero Dawn and God of War 2018 in their respective 60 frames per second PS5 patches. It's a reminder that backcompat is backcompat, and we should likely expect better performance from a native app. Question is, where is the bottleneck? The frame drops are minimal, but they are there. Now, this does seem to be a GPU limitation, albeit a minor one. If we switch the PlayStation 5's video output to 1080p, the renderer defaults to Full HD instead, just as it does on PS4 Pro. And here you can see that the tiny variations off the 60 frames per second target found on the 4K checkerboard output are completely eliminated. So yeah, this would seem to rule out some kind of limitation or bottleneck on the CPU side of the equation. So, this has been a fascinating look at what happens when 30 FPS frame caps are removed from PS4 and PS4 Pro titles. And for me, it effectively hammers down why they are there in the first place. On Gen 8 hardware, there's no magical 60 FPS mode enabled just by turning off the frame rate cap. And the gains are generally so variable that you'd lose all sense of smooth or rather consistent gameplay. But at the same time, in many cases, PlayStation 5 just taps into its backcompat horsepower, and because the game's now running unlocked, it gets us to 60 frames per second with few problems. Not every game, but the ones that count, they really are transformed. Now, if Illusion can deliver this, can Sony and its publishing partners? I guess I can discuss this for a little while as we look at more Red Dead 2 running at 60 FPS on PS5, right? Well, we've already seen a bunch of unlocked patches at the beginning of the generation, but introducing backcompat Plus, as we called it back in the day, wasn't always so straightforward and required games to be updated to the latest development environments. And that's not going to be viable for a great many earlier games. Conceivably, Sony could adopt an OS-level solution that disables its system library for half-rate VSync, whitelisted to certain games, which may well be how some aspects of Microsoft's FPS Boost worked back in the day. But ultimately, we're looking at considerable R&D from Sony and required buy-in from publishers to get the work done. The ball is in Sony's court, basically. Still, that's it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, share if you did, and ring the bell for notifications of some description when we quote-unquote drop new content. But really, it's the DF supporter program where it's at. High quality video downloads of everything we do, early access, bonus materials, weekly notes from the team on what we're all up to, DF Direct weekly privileges, and much, much more. Oh yeah, and please do consider checking out store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising related wares, which also helps to support the team and everything we do. But that's all from me on this particularly epic video, so thanks to Illusion for all of the footage and the insights, and thanks to you for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.